Most of the semester, when we talk about social validity, we're going to be talking about social validity, how it relates to the training project. But as a good supervisor, you also have to remember and regularly think about social validity as it relates to your client. And as a reminder, a client is often the person you're directly providing services to, but often also other relevant people that are part of their lives, like their parents, their teachers. In a lot of families, it could be extended family members, multi generational households. Maybe it's grandma or grandpa. And so, social validity, you have to have a basic understanding of social validity before you even begin to think about it in terms of the training project. So, this is a short video just to focus on the basics of social validity. So, I know that you have learned in your previous coursework about social validity, and I hope you recall that there are three components of social validity. What scares me sometimes is that in our field, I see a lot of people focus on just one aspect of social validity, and we need to be focusing on all three. So, what are these three aspects, just in case you need me to jog your memory? The first aspect of social validity answers the question, are the treatment goals socially important? Now, who decides this? The client decides this. The caregivers decide this. Other relevant people in that child's life decide whether it's a socially important goal. So, for example, like I said, it could be grandma, it could be a preacher. For the family, if being able to go to a church or mosque or synagogue or any temple or house of worship is important to them, and there's a behavior that the primary client is engaging in that prevents them from fully participating in that community activity, then that is a socially important behavior. So it's not you that decides that. It is typically the people who share the life of the client or the client themselves. All right, are there any exceptions? There are some exceptions where you play an important role in determining whether or not a target behavior is socially important. Mostly you just need to be quiet and listen to other people and their views about social importance. And when I say be quiet, I don't mean wait until they stop talking about it. I mean actively engage in a dialogue with them and try to understand from their perspective about what behaviors are most socially important to them. Just because a behavior is most important in your world, don't assume that that's the behavior that's most important in their world. I see this happen all the time. Sometimes people who don't have kids make assumptions about people who do have kids, what's important to them, or vice versa. I see people that live in very different cultures make assumptions about what would be important to somebody else on the basis of their own lived experience. And none of us is capable of doing that. So mostly the treatment goals should be, the social importance of the treatment goals should be determined by the client and the people who touched our lives. My only exception is this. Occasionally you will come across a situation where someone will tell you that a behavior is socially important, but it is actually, if you target that behavior, you're actually treating the client unfairly. So let me give you an example that I have experienced. It's been a lot of years, but I used to work in schools. I've also worked in hospitals. I've run my own program, my own home-based program. I've worked in hospitals. I mean, I've been in a lot of settings providing treatment. Anyway, one that I remember that really stuck out to me, there have been a couple of kids that got referred to me in schools where the behavior that was being targeted could be an appropriate behavior, except for the fact that the change that was needed was zero. So, for example, this particular child irritated the teacher when he would talk out without permission. And I understand that. I can see how frustrating and it would be disruptive. And I do think that's an appropriate target a lot of the time. Why did I decide that this really wasn't a socially important goal? because I collected data on other kids in the classroom, and as it turns out, he was actually talking out less than a lot of the other kids. And so that is a social validity problem where you need to play an active role. You need to be able to share those kinds of data and facilitate that kind of conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that piece of it in just a little while. So let's get back to these three components. So the first one, the goal, is it socially important? The second one, are the procedures appropriate and acceptable? And again, treatment acceptability, this is something that we should be regularly collecting data on. A lot of people do it in research and not enough people do it in practice. If you have a copy of my book, A Practical Guide to Finding Treatments that Work for People with Autism, let me see what chapter this is. Chapter 7. There is a whole chapter in the book with a table that summarizes all of these treatment acceptability measures, and some of them are really short. You should always be spending time actively trying to assess how acceptable treatment procedures are. If you expect people to implement an intervention and they don't find it acceptable and you haven't had a conversation about it, you know what they do? They either don't do it or they don't do it with fidelity. They switch it up to make it fit their context, their culture, their belief system. And so it's foolishness on our part to avoid the issue of treatment acceptability. We have to be focusing on that. Is it appropriate? Is it acceptable? What do I mean by appropriate? I've sometimes seen interventions that are implemented with a 20-year-old that looks like the exact same intervention that was developed for a 5-year-old. That's not appropriate. That's one example. I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about appropriateness. Okay, so the first two, the goals are socially important, the procedures are appropriate and acceptable. The last one, are the outcomes meaningful? And emphasis on meaningful. You know, we are a bunch of data junkies. We love to collect our data. We love to graph our data. I mean, I have actually publicly referred to data as sexy before, and I meant it. Like, a really beautiful research design with beautiful data demonstrating a difference. But here's the problem. You can have all the pretty data in the world. It could be graphed. It can even demonstrate a functional relationship. But if you haven't meaningfully altered somebody's life, the outcome is not meaningful. And so I see this happen sometimes where, for example, people will be all excited that, they taught the client to tact bathroom, but the client can't man bathroom. And in life, being able to man for a bathroom is way more important than tacting. And so the outcome has to be meaningful. Or, yes, you reduced their behavior significantly. There's a 75% drop, but he's poking himself in the eye enough still that his retina is going to get detached and he's going to go blind. I would argue that's not a meaningful outcome. So these three components of social validity, we always have to be assessing. And as supervisors, we need to be constantly reminding our supervisees about these variables and not just whatever particular data collection that they're doing on a specific target at any point in time. All right, so a couple of other things I just want to close on social validity. Social validity involves all of these dimensions. One of them is not enough. But you should be noticing as I talk about social validity and different people and different situations, it's very culturally determined. And so this is a place where a lot of times behavior analysts take their privileged position and make assumptions about whether or not a goal is socially appropriate, whether or not a treatment is acceptable, whether or not the outcome is meaningful. And it's not up to us. Like we have partners in behavior change, and that should include the client way more than it does, but it should also include the people who share their lives. So, like I said, the only case where your vote really has a really strong impact is when the impact on the client is that they're going to be mistreated or held to a different standard than other people in the same setting. But we should be constantly thinking about this in terms of cultural variables. Social validity is about whether or not the treatment target is fair. It should be, and it might be fair in one setting and not fair in another. Social validity should be about whether or not the treatment marginalizes somebody. Social validity should be about whether or not you're building a higher quality of life based on what they feel is a higher quality of life, not based on your belief system, your values. You should be constantly assessing the values of your clients and the people who share their lives. Social validity is about whether or not you'd pick this treatment for yourself in the same situation, or whether you would want somebody to pick this intervention for someone you love. Social validity is about whether or not you're asking somebody to do something that's reasonable when they have a really complicated life. So I want you to think, if you're watching this video during the time of the global pandemic, when there is intense social unrest related to social injustice, I want you to think about how that has tapped you and how your own personal reserves have been lowered in some situation. Your own personal capacity has been lowered. And now imagine somebody coming at you with an extraordinarily complex intervention. How likely is it that it's really acceptable to you? Well, just like those things can be draining and straining to you, other variables influence whether or not an intervention is feasible. I have seen behavior analysts approach parents who have 4 children, 3 of whom are on the autism spectrum, and suggest an incredibly complex intervention for just one of them when they all need supports. I gotta tell you, that does not have a lot of social validity unless the parents, I can't even imagine a parent doing this, but a parent saying, yes, this works for us. This is something we're capable of doing. This is something that is manageable for us. And unless, for example, it's a group-oriented contingency that can be applied to all of the kids, I'm going to guess it's probably not going to be a socially valid intervention. So I want you to think about that for all your clients, but also as a supervisor. How can you guide other people in understanding social validity? And social validity plays as important of a role as the other data that you collect. One last thing. One of the ways that we should be assessing social validity is whether or not it is changing quality of life. And that means that alongside our other data, we should be regularly collecting data about people's affect. So if I have a client who, let's say they're engaging in high rates of aggressive behavior, and I put an intervention in place and I reduce it to near 0 levels or 0 levels, you would probably say, wow, that is amazing, fantastic, especially if I was able to demonstrate a functional relationship. But what if that same intervention left them constantly pulling their sweatshirt over their head? If it left them in the corner crying, or it increased their self-injury? And so a lot of times I see people so focused on one target behavior that they're not looking at other variables that are indicators of social validity, particularly for people who can't communicate very effectively about social validity on their own. So please look at the whole person. Our goal in this field is to improve the human condition based on this incredibly powerful set of behavioral principles we have and the level of precision we can bring to that. But the purpose of doing all of that is to make a difference. And if you lose sight of that, you're not really a great behavior analyst, and you can never be a great supervisor.